Hi, everybody all of you who are just getting into the room. Thanks for joining us. We're going to wait a couple more seconds. I mean, not even a minute, but just a couple more seconds to let people roll in from the lobby, and then we will get started.
I have a mental picture of everyone out in the lobby drinking coffee and eating donuts and Danish pastries.
Oh, that sounds really yummy. I've got the coffee, but not the donuts. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure more folks will trickle in as they leave their other sessions and their chats that they're having in the lobby. So I'm really excited about this session on activism, spirituality, and climate fiction. And am pleased to introduce our speaker for the session. Starhawk is an author and an activist and a permaculture designer and a teacher, a prominent voice in modern earth-based spirituality and ecofeminism. She's the author and or co-author of 13 different books, including The Spiral Dance, which is probably definitely the first book on Wicca and witchcraft that I ever read personally. Also author of the Utopian novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, and its sequel, City of Refuge. Her most recent nonfiction book is called The Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups, and it's about group dynamics, power, conflict, and communications. Starhawk founded Earth Activist Training, teaching permaculture design grounded in spirituality with a focus on activism. She travels internationally, lecturing, teaching on earth-based spirituality, tools of ritual, permaculture, skills of activism. Starhawk, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and really excited to be part of this conference. I thought about, what to speak about climate fiction and activism. And I thought it might be good to begin by talking about how I came to write The Fifth Sacred Thing. Back in the 80s, there was a very powerful movement around that started as an anti-nuclear movement around nuclear power. And here in California, where I live, it was centered around a power plant called the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant that was being built on an earthquake fault. And there were some massive mobilizations around that, including one in 1981 where over 5,000 people were arrested over the course of, about a month. And the plant actually, a combination of our activism and the fact that a whistleblower came forth at the end of the blockade and revealed that the twin power plants had actually confused some of their blueprints, and they built some of the plants backwards, and it took them another 4 years to straighten it all out. At that action, we organized while we were in jail and decided that we had come upon a very powerful form of activism. It was very bottom up. We organized affinity groups that got together and made decisions by consensus, and that was how all the major decisions were made. We had a real strong sense of support for one another. We had people in the affinity groups who would do the action and risk arrest, and others who would do jail support or home support. And in some ways, it was like a month-long intense immersion in a different culture, a different way of living and organizing and making decisions. So we decided to take this into organizing around nuclear weapons and later around anti-intervention work. And it spurred a decade or more of very intense activism for those of us who were involved in it. People often think of the 80s as a time of, where there wasn't a lot going on, but my experience was that it was in some ways even more intense and much better organized than the activism of the 60s and the 70s. And that was a very important background for the Fifth Sacred Thing. Because when I began writing the Fifth Sacred Thing, kind of in the late 80s, it was partly because I'd written several nonfiction books and I was tired of footnotes. I had a little tiny archaic computer that didn't even have a hard drive. It had two little disk drives, and I had one chapter in my book Truth or Dare, Encounters with Power, Authority, and Mystery, that had something like 97 footnotes, and every time I got to footnote 96, it would crash. So I wanted to write something without any footnotes, and I wanted to write fiction, which had always been my dream. And I started writing this mammoth epic that went from the birth of one of my characters, Maya, in 1950, all the way through 100 years into the future in 2050. And eventually, after a few years, when I had a stack of paper, because of course at that time it was all written and printed out, it was like that high, I realized this was never going to get published as one book, and I broke it into two. The future parts of it were more complete than the early parts of it, and that became the Fifth Sacred Thing. And part of what I wanted to do in that book was envision another possibility for the future. I think that is one of the key things that solar punk, that climate fiction, that speculative fiction in general can do. Later in the global justice movement of the late 90s and the 2000s, we had a slogan that says, "Another world is possible." And that was an important counter to what the overall culture was saying, which is Tina, there is no alternative. That was the era after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when people had lost faith in some of the traditional left and the communist kind of organizing. And it seemed like, capitalism was ruling the world, and they certainly wanted us to believe that. And that was the way it was and was always going to be. So posing the idea that there was something else, there could be something else, was a radical challenge to that hegemony of that worldview. And I think that's one of the key roles that we can play as writers, is to actually envision some of that world. So when I wrote The Fifth Sacred Thing, I really took some of the culture of that activism, that anti-nuclear and anti-intervention and affinity group-based, consensus-based, and I was trying to imagine, how would this work if it were really a governing system? How would this work if the ideals that we say we are, defending, what would that actually look like if they were the guiding principles of society? And along with that, I think fiction is most powerful when, it's when it's grappling with some kind of question that you don't really have an answer to. At least for me, that is true. Um, People always say, write about what you know, but there's also good reason for writing about what you don't know. If I know the answer to something, or I think I do, or I have a lot to say that I really want the world to hear, and I write nonfiction, trying to create a persuasive argument and back it up with some form of thinking or evidence, or create a book. Like many of my books are sort of manuals that include things like exercises or things that people can do and try on their own. But when I write fiction, I'm often wrestling with something that I don't know the answer to. And with the fifth sacred thing, it was this question. I had been working in movements that were founded on nonviolence and nonviolent direct action. And was very, very, very committed to that philosophy and that form of activism. But we were also working on things like anti-intervention in Central America, and I was well aware that the risks we were taking as activists were far, far less than people were taking in Central America or in South America, where the systems were much more brutal, where people were actually facing death or torture. And I was questioning how would nonviolence really work in the face of much, much more brutality than we had ever had to face. Along with that was an even larger question for me, because I was also doing a lot of historical research around the question of the transition from the ancient matrifocal, nature-centered, goddess-centered cultures that we had discovered in the 80s were really at the root even of European civilization, and are certainly characteristic of many of the indigenous cultures around the world. How did that transition to patriarchy happen? As a feminist back in the 60s and 70s, we'd been looking at this question: was the world always structured around men ruling women? And certainly there were a lot of people telling us, yes, it's always been this way, it always will be this way. And we were instead looking at the question of, has there ever been anything different? And we discovered through archaeology and through the works of people like Maria Gimbutas, who was the archaeologist, did some of the major work on the early goddess cultures of old Europe, that in fact there had been something very different at the root, again, of the Middle East and of European civilization. And that was very inspiring to us. We were already practicing our own form of nature-based spirituality and religion. And it was nice to know that there was sort of a historical root to it that we could actually document. But it didn't quite answer for me the question of why, when people had really beautiful cultures and religions that were based on peace and on food and sex and pleasure as being sacred and connection to nature, how did this all get turned into top-down authoritarian patriarchy and hierarchy? And why did people go along with it? And how could it have been resisted? Could it have been changed? How could a peaceful culture resist violence without turning itself into the same thing it was fighting against? So I had done a lot of research on that historically, and it became more and more clear to me that the answer was very rooted in war. That as warfare became more endemic, and particularly as society became complex in ways that made warfare and conquest and slavery beneficial to that culture, at least to the winners, not to the losers, that there was kind of an imperative within it to overvalue aggression and brute strength, and to separate off men and women, and make being male something that was at the same time extremely valued and extremely precarious. You know, you could always lose your status as a real man by not behaving in the way the culture defined as courageous. And that definition of courageous had a lot to do with being a soldier in a war who was willing to go and stand there and, while the chariots thunder down, and not move and stay in line and act in concert with other soldiers and be basically an expendable cog in the machinery of a state-sponsored army. Very, very different from indigenous warfare and raiding and, all of that. And that meant that women had to be suppressed. They had to become prizes of war, and not individuals with their own autonomy. And so I think we see those same dynamics operating today. If we look at our political discourse, Trump is like the great example of this, because if you listen to what he says, if you think about his speech at the January 6th insurrection, what did he say? He said, you can't take back your country with weakness. And weakness means being womanlike, being afraid, being compassionate, having concern for your own life, being vulnerable, all of those things that are actually such important components of being human, all get defined as weakness, and strength, being naked aggression, is the only thing that's valued. So that was the underlying question for me in the Fifth Sacred Thing. How do you face all of that? Could you actually respond to that without using violence? And for those of you who are writers, I really recommend thinking about your work, especially works of speculative fiction, climate fiction, is to find a question that you don't know the answer to, and then let that question generate characters and generate a plot and generate the action of your novel or your story. Because I think where we kind of go off track as writers is, and especially when we're activists, when we're thinking politically, is when we really want to persuade people of something, or we really want to teach people something, or we really want to show people something, and it gets didactic and it loses the richness of the characters and the magic kind of that brings a novel alive. So in The Fifth Sacred Thing, There was a culture in the North that kind of represented that ecologically balanced, multicultural, multiracial, feminist society that we were envisioning. And that was really a fun part, to trying to imagine that and kind of walk around San Francisco and mentally knock down some buildings and put up some others and imagine where they would meet to make decisions and how they would do that, and where they would have rituals and ceremonies and how they would do that, and how they would organize and just bring that whole world alive. And again, I think that's one of the other things that climate fiction and solar punk and this can do is, in some ways, it's like a thought experiment. If you allow yourself to really go into it, you can create a world that's incredibly rich. And if you're a good fiction writer, then you worry about things, like I often think about that with all of these conspiracy conspiracy theories that are so rampant now. I think they work for people kind of like writing fiction works for a fiction writer, where you create this other world in your imagination and you invest it with so much energy and so much thought, so much speculation, that it kind of becomes real to you. It's sometimes more real to you than the world of your flesh and blood friends and relatives and, actual chores that you have to do and are around you. Um, but the difference is, as a fiction writer, you actually have to think things out. If you're writing fiction about some plot to blow up the Twin Towers and make it look like an attack, you have to actually kind of think out, well, who's going to actually set those charges, and how are they going to carry them? Are they going to carry them in backpacks and walk in? How are they going to get into the building? What are they going to do with the night guards? What about the security cameras? You really have to think it out, almost as in much detail as if you were really doing it. Um, Whereas with a conspiracy theory, you can just skip over all of that and not have to ask yourself, how would this actually work in real life? So I think, again, as speculative writers, we can create that other world that we know that is possible. And then it's our obligation to try to make it as real and as vivid and as detailed and as practical as we possibly can. That said, like, you also have to draw the line somewhere. Like, I could very easily, in the fifth sacred thing, have happily gone into all the plumbing details for putting together the cisterns that catch water in every house and store it so there's water in the summer. But at a certain point, you have to kind of say, do the readers really need to know this level of detail? Otherwise, you really risk boring people to death. So again, in the fifth sacred thing, the North is that vision of that peaceable culture, and then the Southlands, Southern California, becomes the culture that sort of extrapolates the negative trends, becomes autocratic and racist and sexist and militarist and invades the North. And the people in the North have to respond to that and say, are we going to do that with violence or with nonviolence? Can that really work? How could that really work? And I don't think, I mean, I think a lot of people read the novel and see it as, an argument for nonviolence. And I guess in part it is, but I don't feel like it answers that question. Um, it wasn't my goal to definitively answer that question, but more to explore it and kind of act it out in the imagination and see where that goes. When I wrote the sequel many years later, um, City of Refuge, it was strongly influenced by the Occupy movement, which had happened right in that summer when I was involved in writing it. And I had been able to visit probably 11 or 12 different occupations because I had written um, the Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups, which is all about organizing and group dynamics. And I had set up a little tour to go around and do trainings and workshops and talk about the book. And so I was traveling to lots of different cities and towns and getting to visit a lot of the occupations. And I saw them all struggling so hard with so many different things that really came back to that question again of human relations. So in City of Refuge, the underlying question is actually a little bit different for me. The question is really, how do we build that new world when people are so deeply damaged by the old? And there are different characters in it who each in some ways kind of represent that dilemma. Um, and then the magic of writing a novel is your characters kind of come alive and take on a life of their own, and sometimes take the story to places where you wouldn't expect it. Um, for me, also, the writing fiction always has a spiritual aspect. Spirit not in the sense of a dogmatic religion, but again, as the way as humans we grapple with those big questions we don't have simple answers to, like what is life about? What is it for? Uh, how are we supposed to live? Um, why do we die? What happens to us after death? And what's the point of life if it ends? Uh, how do we come together as a community? Um, how can we create ways where we can face together those aspects of life that are so hard to face alone, like loss and grief and pain? So I've always been in my own life very much involved in practicing and teaching earth-based spirituality and writing about it and creating rituals and creating ceremonies. And naturally, a lot of that went into the fifth sacred thing. And I encourage people to bring that in to your writing and your work and your life. Again, it doesn't have to come in a didactic way. It can come in um, through your characters, through their struggles, through their actions, through the things that they do. Um, but I think it creates an underpinning of depth to the writing that we're doing and the exploration that we're doing. I think human beings have some very basic, very powerful needs. And one of them is the need to feel a sense of purpose, to feel like you're aligned with a greater purpose. I think those needs can be exploited and misused. And I think we see that happening all around us with the rise of like extremism and, extreme right-wing groups that really prey on that and give people a very false and dangerous sense of purpose. But I think fiction can also give people a sense of that connection and the larger purpose. So at this point, I thought I would read you a little passage from the Fifth Sacred Thing. And this is part of the opening of the book. So in some ways it's one of the more didactic parts, but it's really where the whole culture is being set out. The whole world is being created for you. And it takes place when they are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the uprising, the time when the United States kind of came apart at the seams and the Western part, established itself as this beautiful, non-hierarchical culture. And Maya, who is speaking, is the old woman who is the character that kind of runs from her birth in 1950 to the 100 years of the times in which the novels take place. And she's serving in some ways as a kind of priestess. The drums began to beat, a trance rhythm, steady but just slightly syncopated, to lead the mind, and then shifted in unexpected directions. Maya spoke, her voice rhythmic, musical, crooning an incantation. Este es el tiempo de la segadora, the time of the reaper, she who is the end inherent in the beginning, scythe to the grain. The Crone, goddess of harvest. In this, her season, we celebrate the ancient feast of the Celtic sun god Lu, his wake as he ages and descends into autumn. It's a time of sweet corn, ripening tomatoes, the bean drying on the vine. The harvest begins. We reap what we have sown. The Crone, the reaper, is not an easy goddess to love. She's not the nurturing mother. She's not the maiden, light and free, not pretty, not shiny like the full or crescent moon. She is the dark moon, what you don't see coming at you, what you don't get away with, the wind that whips the spark across the fireline. Chance, you could say, or what's scarier still, the intersection of chance with choices and actions made before. The brush that is tinder dry from decades of drought, the warming of the Earth's climate that sends the storms away north, the hole in the ozone layer. Not punishment, not even justice, but consequence. We hope for a harvest, we pray for rain, but nothing is certain. We say that the harvest will only be abundant if the crops are shared, that the rains will not come unless water is conserved and shared and respected. We believe we can continue to live and thrive only if we care for one another. This is the age of the reaper, when we inherit 5,000 years of postponed results, the fruits of our callousness toward the earth and toward other human beings. But at last we have come to understand that we are part of the earth, part of the air, the fire, and the water, as we are part of one another. So that's just a little taste of the Fifth Sacred Thing. I'd love to open it up for some questions and discussions if people want to post those in the Q&A, I guess. And I don't know if Justine, if you can maybe help field some of them.
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
So one question that we have is about the role of spirituality in activism. And so it can be kind of simple, I guess, to often dismiss the role that spirituality can play, and that even religion and religious organizations, for that matter, can play in activism and in social movements. And so the question is there anything in particular that you see spirituality and that sort of framework and worldview bringing to activist movements that maybe wouldn't be there otherwise?
Yeah, I think there's some very important roles that spirituality can play. On the left, it's often been harder to bring it in because a lot of the traditional left kind of formed in opposition to this kind of church and state hegemony and the doctrine and dogma of particularly the Christian churches, and drew a lot from Marx and the religion is the opiate of the people, and allied itself very much with modernism and science and technology. So it's sometimes, hard to counter that kind of inherent cynicism. Think about it.
Oops, looks like your video froze there, Starhawk. Sorry, folks, bear with us while we see if we can clean up the connection. There we go. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
All right, how's that?
Great.
So I was saying, a lot of the anti-slavery movement came out of the Quakers and the Unitarians, out of this a spirituality that saw each person as their inner authority, not a religion of dogma. We've seen how important the Black church has been in the civil rights movement. And today we see so much of the environmental and the climate movement really led by indigenous people, and for whom spirituality has always been integrated in everything. And I think about some of the great moments like Standing Rock back in 2016, which I was really privileged to go to for just a few days, really, but just the integration there of the culture, of the spirituality of the Native Americans, um, of a way of doing politics where it wasn't just about anger and protest, but it was about calling yourself water protectors and saying water is sacred, and sacred in the sense of what's most important to us. So I think having that kind of spiritual base, again, one that's not dogma, it's not about having to believe in something that you can't see. I always say goddess religion, nature based, earth based spirituality. It's not about belief in the unseen, it's about looking at what you can see and experiencing it with a sense of awe and wonder and reverence, watching a leaf fall from the tree and fall to the ground and decay and turn into nutrients that feed the roots of that tree, and understanding that cycle as a miracle and as this, tremendous moving force of regeneration that moves through all things. That doesn't require belief in some story about something, that doesn't require like supernatural miracles. It's about understanding that nature itself is full of miracles. Um, and I think when that motivates our activism, and when it motivates the writing that comes out of that activism, again, it gives it a depth and it gives it a sense of hopefulness for people. I also think spirituality is important as an activist, especially if you can join in community around it, because it helps sustain and nurture you. And it's hard to be an activist. It's often very discouraging. You very rarely see immediate, positive results from your activism. So having a community to help you go through the hard stuff is really important. And we've done many, many examples of bringing ritual or something actually into an action to create a different energy there. And, I think about times like when we've been at a blockade, like in Quebec City in 2001, where we were protesting the free trade area of the Americas and the expansion of globalization that was leaving a lot of people out of the loop. And we had a whole pagan cluster we created that was really well organized and we could move through the streets together. We had scouts who would run ahead and find out where there was danger. We had groups organized around those who were willing to go to the front lines and those who needed to be safer and had ways of doing that. And we could go up to the front lines and hold a spiral dance with tear gas canisters flying over our heads. And a lot of people kind of came and joined in with us because they said they just felt better. They felt safer. They felt like they were with people who were holding an energy and a space in the middle of the chaos that allowed them to feel grounded and centered and calm. So, there's a magical teaching that I think really informs a lot of what I think of as solar punk or climate fiction. And that is that you have to be able to envision what you want and not just what you don't want. If you're doing a magical spell or ritual and you want to bring love into your life, you can't just go there and say, "Dear great powers of the universe, don't send me another rotten lover like the one I just got rid of." Because then you have in your mind all the horrors of your horrible relationship, and you're actually directing energy into that and attracting that same pattern. You have to be able to envision the kind of relationship you want. Maybe that's waking up in bed together and having a partner who brings you coffee and sitting there and reading the paper together. I guess nowadays it would be more scrolling on your cell phones, whatever. Maybe it's, having someone who'll pick up the kids after their soccer game. Maybe it's someone who'll lick mango juice off your naked body on a tropical beach. Whatever it is, you have to have that image in your mind and put energy into it in order to attract that to you. And I often think about that because the world is so full of dystopian fiction and movies and TV shows, and it's so easy in some ways to imagine it all going wrong. And there's much, much less imagining how it might go right or how it might be reconfigured in different and more liberating ways. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do as writers of speculative fiction, is to help create that vision of the world that we want.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for. That's what we're doing today. So another question, this one about your writing a little bit more specifically. And so the question is, in solar punk and in other like hope punk and other kinds of utopian writing and these sorts of newer genres, one of the big themes is harmony between humanity and nature, whether it already exists or struggling to create that harmony, and of course solving climate change and fixing the damage that we've already done to whatever extent we can as part of that. But so then the question is, because fifth sacred thing in particular is often talked about as, I mean, it was written before solar punk was a word or a thing, but it's often talked about as a sort of a forerunner or a predecessor of the genre. And so where in fifth sacred thing, and also in the follow-up City of Refuge, do you see that theme coming through? Does that theme play an important role in either of those books?
Yes, I think it plays a very important role in both of them. But again, for me, like, well, I'll say that my day job now is directing an organization called Earth Activist Training that teaches permaculture design and regenerative land management, and actually is very much involved with all the practical aspects of what we can actually do to help fix the world. And so I'm immersed in that and teaching it all the time and thinking about it, learning more about it, practicing it. So to me, that's kind of the background, the ground of the fifth sacred thing. And it comes into City of Refuge as well, especially through the character of Cress, who's the the permaculturalist, the agriculturalist who goes down with the army to the Southlands because he's also a very angry person, to liberate them. And, you know, through his visions of how that land can be regenerated, to me are some of my favorite parts of that book. But I think in some ways, you know, for me, what's important is, again, not to necessarily be didactic, but more to bring the things like that regeneration into the fabric of the world that you create. So I've been writing a series of short stories recently, inspired by Justine getting in touch with me and letting me know there is a genre now called solar punk. I was like so happy, you know, for so long, like nobody really knew what to do with the fifth sacred thing because it was futuristic fiction, but it wasn't Mad Max. And, you know, everyone sort of has this idea that if it's about the future, it's got to be, you know, Fury Road. And so I've been writing more a series where the questions are really more around gender, around like, what would it be like if we thought of gender as a verb instead of a noun or an identity? And what are all the different ways a culture might construct gender differently, and how would that play out in human relations? But the background is it's in a group of the religious order of regenerators who devote themselves to restoring the damaged land. So that's all there, but it's maybe, again, it's more the ground more than front and center. I think there definitely can be writing where it's front and center, but the danger is that it can really become didactic that way.
Sure. Okay, so the next question, you already touched on it a bit when you told us about the series of short stories that you are starting or that you're working on. But so the question was that you know, the audience member had seen and read your story that appeared in the first issue of Solarpunk magazine, were wondering if you were writing more. So you answered that, but I guess sort of a follow-up on that. Aside from short stories, have you put any thought into potentially a new novel? Are you working on anything more longer form, or just are you just having fun writing short stories right now?
I'm thinking about a new novel. It's still very much in the thinking stage, and the short stories in some ways are kind of a trial of what that might be like. But whether that will become a novel or become a series of short stories hasn't quite formulated yet. And I'm also thinking about writing a more historical novel in a different genre.
Nice, interesting. Let's see, we do have a little bit more time. So Simone said, oh, well, one just wants to thank you for all of your activism, and the inspiration is much appreciated. And then is wondering if you know yet where the short stories that you're writing will be available. Are you putting them together in a book, or do you have plans with any magazines or anything like that? That you can, I mean, and only if you can reveal those details, of course.
Well, I wrote a second one for Solar Punk, but it was too long for the magazine. So Justine's going to put it out in an anthology. And I will, as I write some others, I imagine they'd first come out in Solar Punk or possibly other magazines. And then hopefully eventually, when I get enough of them together, they could come out as a collection.
Yeah, I mean, we would always be happy to publish them at Solarpunk Magazine. We don't want to be story hogs or anything. If there's other magazines out there too that you're interested in or that are interested, but yeah, that's great to hear. And I'll put the link for folks to that anthology that the novelette will be appearing in. That comes out at the end of January, this coming January. I'll throw that link in the chat really quickly here. Other than that, it looks like the questions have sort of wrapped up. Anyone else with a last minute question? We've got a few short minutes left. If there is a last question, if not, that's fine too. We can go ahead and wrap up. Give folks a second.
And while people are thinking, I should say, I do a lot of online teaching, both around spirituality and around permaculture. If you go to my website, which is starhawk.org, you'll see everything there, including I have a magical activism class that's ongoing that you can join in on, and it's by donation, so it's accessible for anyone who might want to be part of it. I also do a regular meditation on Friday mornings at 9 a.m. Pacific time on Instagram. That's a kind of magical activism meditation. And we have a lot of wonderful permaculture courses coming up, including one I'm starting on Sunday. That's on the empowerment manual. It's called Empowering Collaborative Groups, about group dynamics and how to organize together. So I invite you all to check that out at earthactivisttraining.org.
Great. I'll throw that in the chat here as well. Great. Okay, well, it looks like that is all of the questions. Oops, I might have spelled that wrong. I'll fix it. Yeah, it looks like that's all the questions. So Starhawk, I want to thank you again so much for being here and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your thoughts and your words with us. Really enjoyed hearing what you have to say and participating in the dialogue. I'm sure everybody else did as well. So yeah, you can, again, the link is there in the chat, so you can check out the anthology that Starhawk's upcoming novelette is going to be published in. And next up on the agenda for the day is a break. It's social networking in the break rooms. Up until now, there's been technical difficulties with the break rooms. I think I got it figured out. So hopefully in the next couple minutes, folks will be able to start getting into the different break rooms. Until then, at the very least, the lobby is open and the chat's open there, so folks can still interact and network with each other that way. So Starhawk, thanks again. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And we really appreciate you being here and sharing your time with us.
Thank you. And thank you for all that you do. I think this work that you're doing is so hopeful and so important.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody at Android Press and Solarpunk Magazine appreciate it as well. Okay, so thanks again. And we will talk to you later. And we'll see folks in the lobby in the break rooms.
Bye.